Wel, diolch i chi am y croeso. Mae'n braf iawn bod nôl ym Mhenllyn, Llyw Llyn ydw i'n wreiddiol, mod i'n symud yn flwyddyn a hanner lawr i Caerdydd. So it's a pleasure to be with you here. And my intention is to do the talk bilingually. I won't try and translate everything, but I'll overlap a bit from one language to the other is my intention. See how it goes. So dyma'n amlinelliad ni as an outline. First of all, looking at the immense, which is the universe. Dwi ddim yn astrophysegydd. Yr ail faes ydy'n arbenigedd i. My speciality is in the processes of the cell that are too small to see down a normal microscope. But we will look at both, and then we'll look at the reaction of King David 3,000 years ago, and ymateb y brenin Dafydd, blynyddoedd mawr yn ôl. Dwi wedi rhoi fewn darluniau, so there'll be a lot of pictures. Mae nhw o'r ardaloedd mwyaf photogenic y bydysawd, nifer ohonyn nhw, achos wrth gwrs mae rhan fwyaf o'r gwagle yn wag. Most of the universe is, of course, empty, but I'll try and give you some pictures. A nebula, nivel, is just something that gives off light. Okay, so, and what you see here is a star that has come to the end of its life. Mae y seren yn farw, a wrth i na ddigwydd, mae'n dueddol o gwasgu fewn, a wedyn chi'n cael rhyw ffrwydriad. You can see here the wave of gas expelled by the star. And for each of the pictures, I have put the distance in light years. Okay, so y ffordd hawdda dwi'n ffindio i sôn am speed golau ydy mewn un eiliad, mae golau yn gallu teithio 7 gwaith o gwmpas y byd. Okay, na syniad, mewn un eiliad. So pan chi'n sôn am bellter o 700 blwyddyn golau, gewch chi weithio allan y maths erbyn diwedd y ddarlith. Un arall sydd yn hardd iawn, welwch chi mewn sawl cyfrwng. Mae'n chydig bach yn bellach allan, ond mae dal yn galaxy ni. It's the Horsehead Nebula, and it's backlit, of course, by stars. And what you see there is dust and gas, but happens to be in the shape of a horse head. Mae'n chydig bach yn bellach eto. A chi'n gweld nwy diffurfio ag yn casglu ag eto dioleuo'r tu ôl. It's backlit and it's gas and dust. Nawr dyn ni'n chydig bach yn bellach i ffwrdd. Yn edrych ar ardal lle mae ser yn ffurfio. Mae ser yn ffurfio yn o bol wrth i lwch gasglu at ei gilydd dan gravity, felly disgyrchiant yn Gymraeg. So stars form by dust being pulled together under gravity, and it gets denser and denser, and as it gets denser and denser, it gets hotter and hotter, until you start having the fusion processes happening that drive the star. And then they live a long time and then die, as we saw. So these are areas of dust 10 million light years away where stars are forming. Nawr, dyn ni'n edrych ar galaxy galaeth cyfan. The spiral galaxy, galaeth troellog, is phenomenal. One galaxy has about 100 billion stars. It's phenomenal, isn't it? And yeah, so 100 billion. So you see I've put in a 10 to the 11 there in brackets. That's just a scientist's way of writing 1 followed by 11 zeros. Okay, so that's 100 billion. This is an image I first saw in the mid-90s, and it was quite deeply emotional. We had a prof in the department who had been part of one of the teams, a member of one of the teams for the telescopes on the Hubble Space Telescope, which was launched in the early 90s. Dwi'n gwybod os chi'n cofio, rhaid o gywiro fo, astronauts fyny i gywiro fo. And it started to work in the mid-90s. And because Mike Disney was working on the instruments, we had the images back before they were made public. A dwi'n cofio just dod mewn i'r adran un bore a gweld hwn ar ddrws y post-room. A ni just edrych mewn syndod. Dwi'n allai gofio rwan dagren do lawr yng ngwyneb i. Ni just edrych mewn y chwarter awr. Be oedden nhw wedi wneud oedd cymryd yr Hubble Space Telescope a just bwyntio fan bythefnos cyfan i un cyfeiriad i ran o'r awyr oedd yn dywyll. They looked on a dark piece of sky that's only about a 50th of the size of the moon in the sky. Okay, just a very small patch. And they just took an image over a period of a fortnight, just keeping it pointing the same direction. From Earth's telescopes, you could see nothing in that area apart from 1 or 2 stars. Welwch chi, yr un disgler yn y ffrant, seren agos di hwnna, that's a close star, the one that you can see that's got rays coming off them. The rest, nearly all of them, are just galaxies with 100 billion stars. The most distance is about 7 billion light years away. We live in a big universe. And as I said, each of the galaxies would have about 10 to the billion stars, 10 billion stars. How many galaxies are there? About 1,000 billion, about 1 trillion galaxies is the estimate. The number of galaxies, each on average having about 100 billion. You know, there'll be some bigger, some a lot smaller. And tua 100 billion o serum bob un. A dwi'n cofio edrych ar y darlun yma yn nghanol y 90au ac yn meddwl, mae hwn yn fawr ac yn hen. Ond mae'r hwn sy'n tu ôl iddo yn fwy ac yn hyn. The one behind it is bigger and older. And of course, we've mentioned the Hubble telescope on the left, the Webb on the right. The Webb works in the infrared, which means that it can see things which are much colder. Okay, so in the visible, you see the hot things, the stars and things like that. And, you know, dust you see because it's backlit by stars. You wouldn't see it otherwise. Tra mae'r Webb telescope eto yn y gofod yn cael ei gadw'n oer iawn, felly fydd ddim yn byw yn hir iawn, rai blynyddoedd yn ei thebyg, ond gallu gweld y stwff oer. And so you see here in the galaxy, in the left is the visible with the Hubble. With the Webb on the right, you see the center, it's not bright because it's seeing the colder stuff. But you can see the arms very clearly with all the dust networks. And the middle one is where they've combined the two. Cymysgu'r ddau efo'i gilydd. Just clean nice. So, o'r James Webb telescope, do you know? So dyna just ddarlun o'r gofod, pictures of the universe. What I'm going to move on to is something that I know more about. Looking at processes that happen in every living cell. And I'm not going to explain the science, we'll just show a couple of videos and pictures. So what I'm going to show you now happens in bacteria, in the grass we walk on, in all animals, in ourselves. Okay, and I'm not going to explain anything. What I want you to do is just to watch what happens, and in terms of an impression, really. Now, we all know about the double helix of DNA, right? So you've got two strands wound around each other, on which all the genetic code is written. And we understand the picture on the left. Basically, when a cell divides, you have two daughter cells. One strand goes into one cell, the other strand goes into the other cell, and you've got to make up the second strand. All right, so mae rhaid chi, pan mae gell yn rhannu, mae un o'r strandiau yn mynd i un gell, llall i'r gell arall, a wedyn mae rhaid neu fyny yr ail strand y bob un. A mae rhaid cywiro yn barhaus. Be dwi'n mynd i wneud rwan i ddangos y ffordd mae'r DNA yn cael ei gopio. Byddech chi'n edrych lawr microscope allech chi'n gweld yn byd. Right, so, microscope golau o leia. Mae'r DNA yn dod fewn o'r chwith. The DNA comes in from the left there into this complex that does the copying. Oh, and let me just start that. You can just watch what happens. It comes in, that blue thing splits the two strands like a zip and fastener. One strand is copied directly to the right. That's the easy one. The other strand is copied backwards, so you're having to re-pick up the spool all the time. We're all doing it now. Very happy to talk about it if anyone wants to ask questions, but I just want you to see what is happening all the time in every living cell. We have about 10 trillion cells in our bodies. You can see those down the microscope. In each cell, there's about 2 meters, just under 2 meters of DNA. O mae'r rhy gul I chi allu gweld. Ym mhob eiliad, bydde'r DNA dyn ni'n gopio mewn un eiliad drwy'r broses yna yn bob un o'r triliwn o gellau. Byddech chi'n rhoi o ben wrth ben, byddai'n ymestyn rownd y byd. Copio syfrdanol sy'n mynd mlaen drwy'r amser yn cyrff ni. In each of our 10 to the 13 cells, 10 trillion cells, the DNA that is copied, if you put it end to end, what's copied in 1 second would stretch around the world. No knots. And then there's proofreading going on top. Because the error rate you get from this is about 1 in 10,000. It's not nearly good enough even for bacteria. There's proofreading going on and correction to get it down to a level of 1 in 10 million, which is the minimum a bacterium needs. And we need 1 in a billion or so, error rate. So there is error correction going on all the time. And that's the copying of DNA. Okay. Going on to the energy system of life. This is one that I know very well, and I've got a research paper I'm trying to finish at the moment. It's the, you know, without cars, you burn petrol to carbon dioxide and water. It goes to the atmosphere. See Robert here is a car mechanic, and yeah, you know that. But in life, you know, what would be good is if you could put the carbon dioxide and water back together again, isn't it? Recycle it. Life does it all the time. The fuel of life is ATP, adenosine triphosphate. It burns, actually it's a reaction with water in the presence of an enzyme to give you the diphosphate, ADP. And every process in our bodies and in bacteria and grass, etc., uses ATP. It's the energy source for everything. Without energy, you can't do anything, basically. But the recycler is that little enzyme. You see the size? We know what a millimeter is, don't we? Yeah? Well, a nanometer is 1/1,000,000th of a millimeter. Right? So we're going down many orders, and the size is about 20, 30 nanometers of this motor. And it recycles our fuel in bacteria, in every living cell, basically. And it is phenomenal. It's actually driven, we know it's electric motor, but normally they're driven by electrons. These are driven by protons. And the protons are produced by digestion, you know, from food, or photosynthesis in plants. Right? And it creates more protons one side of this membrane compared to the other. A felly mae'r hydroprotonau ffindio I ffordd fewn o dros y membrane o un ochr i'r llall. And, sorry, I should have brought a pointer, I've got one in my bag. But basically, that rotor can only turn in one direction. It just shakes like this, but it can't go past. There's actually a positive charge on this side, and protons can't go past. So they have to rattle their way around this way and out. And that turns the central shaft, which is this kind of shape, and then it enables the ADP and phosphates, which are the products, to be put back together again. So basically, there's catalytic site, the ADP and the phosphate bind and basically squeeze together by the lower motor and puts the ATP back together again. Then it opens up and releases the recycled ATP. I've got a little video here of it happening. Looks very sedate. You see it turning. Troy. Magenta is the ATP that's produced, and there's other molecules going in and out. And it's very relaxed watching it, isn't it? The fact is, I worked it out, that in our bodies we have about 1,000 trillion, that's probably an underestimate actually, of these that recycle our fuel all day. Within one day, we recycle about 60 kilograms of ATP, which isn't far off our body weight of fuel. Is just recycled by these little motors. And they whirl around about 100 times a second, remaking ATP. And around the turn of the century, there was a Japanese group who wanted to see, because it's too small to see in a microscope. So be wnaethon nhw, a droi y benyweired, sicr motor ar microscope slide, a'r siafft ganol ma'n, tynnu'r motor, yr motor gwylod allan, a wedyn sticio moleciwl hir fe'n rhoi golau ffwr. Right? So they stuck basically upside down on a slide, and they wanted to feed in ATP and see if it turned. So imagine that little 20 nanometer motor being the size of my fist, right? The other end of that molecule, the red molecule on the left that gives off light, would be way down the high street somewhere, right? On that scale. So they were feeding in ATP just to see if they could see it turning. What they were hoping to see was that. Now, what did they see? You see it turning and giving off light in the process? It's struggling because it's a small motor with a very long molecule it's trying to turn in water, so it's not easy. But what you're looking at there is it's actually two motors coupled together that provide the energy for all life. All living cells produce. And we produce about 1 with 21 zeros of ATP molecules every second, because we need it to keep, knock off 1 zero and we wouldn't be able to survive. And it's a remarkable motor. Now, when you're dealing with questions of God and science, I just have a few comments here on the slide. So we've dealt with the immense, we've dealt with the very small that you can't see down in microscopes. I'm going to go on to the reactions of King David, but I'd like to just say some things about the gross misunderstandings that happen when you're discussing science and God. Pethau sydd yn mae bobl yn meddwl mor hawdd, ac eto, jyst eisiau dod â chydig bach o meddwl am y cwestiwn, chydig bach dyfnach. One of the key problems is that people think that you have to choose between science and God. Di gwyddoniaeth ddim yn neud ynglyn â Duw, na bwriad unrhyw berson a dim byd o'r teip. Right? Chi just delio efo prosesau. But if I can just give a silly example. If you asked me why the kettle's boiling in the kitchen, so chi'n gofyn pan bod y tegell yn berwi, fel ffisegydd allan ni ddeud, wel, mae'n neud oherwydd bod ynni trydanol yn mynd fewn i'r element, a mae'n codi speed average o'r moleciwlau yn y dŵr, ac yn y blaen. We could explain it in terms of the current through the element, releasing energy which increases the average velocity of the molecules in the water. Right? But if you asked me that question, why is the kettle boiling, you're far more likely to get the answer, well, because I'd like a cup of tea. Would you like one? See, you don't have to choose between those two explanations, do you? If you're flying on a jet across the Atlantic and you ask how the jet engine, why the jet engine enables us to fly, lle chi ddeud, aerodynamics, you could answer in terms of aerodynamics and all the rest. Or you can say, because Frank Whittle invented it. Again, you don't have to choose between those two, do you? In fact, you need both. Aerodynamics alone wouldn't get you across the Atlantic. So you need the mechanism, you need the agents behind it. Or if it wasn't Frank Whittle, someone else would have invented it. That's one misunderstanding, in my view. Ond mae'n ein dyfnach, a hwn di'r un dwi'n meddwl sy'n creu fwyaf o broblem. I think the second one is the main reason. It's to do with how we do science. If I can explain, mi'n hyn just yn Saesneg, os di'n iawn. We've got a laptop and a data projector, right? if we got all the scientists around to investigate how they communicated, you can measure the signals, etc. Now, whether it was a Christian, a Hindu, a Muslim, an atheist, we would all approach it the same way. We'd work together on it. You'd measure the signals, try and work out, and you'd find out that there are digital signals going down the cable between the two. They both have to work to the same code. This is the writer, this is the reader. If they worked to different codes, they wouldn't work. We could study that. Okay, so we ignore any outside agents or any question of God or anything else and just study the signals. But if we asked, where did that system come from? Os ydych chi'n gofyn o le ddath y system yna, wel, ydych chi'n gallu esbonio sut mae'n gweithio'n iawn. You can explain how it works in terms of the signals, and you don't need to mention agents. But a system like that doesn't come about in this case, clearly, right? Now, don't misunderstand me as trying to simply extend that to life. But because even a system like this could be made in a robotic factory with no people present, right? It's all controlled from computers. But not only now have you got the coding problem here, and the readers and writers, you've also got the coding that is used to control the robots that make the machines, you know, the laptop and the data projector. And simply saying, well, we did all our science in terms of natural processes, as we did in terms of looking at the signals, doesn't fully explain where they come from. Because even with an automated process, you need the infrastructure that allows that to happen. Does that make sense? And I've had so many discussions with science colleagues where you get into this kind of discussion about origins, and I'm not against, you know, evolution or any particular mechanism. All I want to see is the evidence for things. But once I mention that I'm a Christian, I believe that there is a creator, however he did it, they say, oh, but that's not science. Well, I understand, and I kind of agree, because it's not science like we were studying these here. But you can't then use the fact that science only deals with natural processes to limit your answers to natural processes, can you? It's not logically consistent. And I've had that experience many times, and sometimes when the discussion continues, you get to a point, you really discuss, and it takes 40 minutes often. And it's not often I've got to this point, but when I have, I ask the question, now, does your atheism really come from science? Or is atheism the filter through which you look at science? Is it an input or an output? And the 3 or 4 times I've got into that discussion, the topic of the conversation has changed immediately. Either that or 1 or 2 people have got extremely angry at that point. You see, because what's happening is they're assuming atheism and looking at science through that and limiting the answers to entirely natural processes. Well, in a sense, that's fine, that's science. But you can't use your method to limit your answers, or there's a problem. And there's one further issue that I think is important, that an atheist has no choice other than natural processes. I mean, there's just no other possibility, is there? Unless you think Martians or someone out there, you know, has done it. Now, as a Christian, I'm entirely open to God using whatever process he wanted. But I'm not going to assume that they have to be natural processes. God could have used entirely natural processes, but I'm not going to assume that he did. And those three issues are involved in so much misunderstanding. Right, let's come on to the last section. Ymateb y brenin Dafydd. Fi oedd Dafydd yn fugail am rhan cyntaf ei oes, allan drwy'r nos efo'r defed. Mae'n eithaf yn gorwedd nôl yn edrych ar y sêr. Ac oedd yr awyr yn dywyll bryd hynny. So David had been a shepherd and done much staring at the universe. And what he sees, and he says, is, wrth edrych allan i'r gofod y gweld gwaith dyfysedd, y lleiad a'r sêr a'r sodais neu lle, beth ydy pobl i ti boeni amdanyn nhw? Pam cyfrif sylw o un person dynol? I can read it in English. A pan dyn edrych ar y darlun o'r bydysawd pell, welson ni o'r Hubble Space Telescope, chi'n meddwl, ie, beth dyn ni i gymharu a'r bydysawd a'r diw sydd tu ôl efo. Mewn salm arall, mae salm 19, mae Dafydd eto yn edrych ar y bydysawd. David is again looking at the universe and says that the heavens declare the glory of God. The skies proclaim the work of his hands. Nodwch, yn aml dyn ni'n cael y cwestiwn yn codi, beth am bobl sy'n erioed i clywed am Dduw? Neu am Iesu Grist, neu beth bynnag dy'r cwestiwn. Be mae Dafydd yn dweud ydy, wel, yn iawn, does na neb sy'n heb glywed o gwbl. Mae pawb wedi cael y bydysawd. You see, David is king of a small country of Israel 3,000 years ago. And they have God's word as what part of the Old Testament they had at the time. That he's kind of asking, well, what about the rest of the world? He says, well, they have the skies to at least suggest that there is someone behind it. You know, it obviously doesn't speak strongly, but nevertheless, it does speak. And there is, in fact, no one who hasn't heard whatsoever, not saying necessarily that that in itself is enough. But then he goes on, mae'n mynd mlaen i sôn am air Duw yn y Beibl, yn yr Hen Testament, fel oedd gen nhw ar y pryd. And I just wanted to highlight the way he describes God's word. He sees it as perfect, sure, trustworthy, precious, sweet. And the reason is that David is in relationship with the God he serves. He was a good king. He looked after people. It's clear from other psalms that he trusted God in very tough circumstances. When people were attacking him, and as any political person gets. Not only that, chi'n cofio bod o wedi cael sôl rhedeg ar ei ôl am flynyddoedd yn gorfod dianc i ogofau yn yr anialwch, having to escape from King Saul, who was trying to kill him, living in caves in the desert. A mi fethodd o Dduw gymoedd o wraig un o'i filwyr yn wraig iddo fo, a gyna cynllwyno I ladd y gŵr. He took one of his soldiers' wives, his soldier's wife as his own wife, and even planned to get him killed. And a friend had to show him how he was going against God totally in that time. And after he said a deep sorry to God and experienced God's forgiveness, how precious that was. And he says that in his Psalms. Hynny, iddi fywyd teulu brenhinol mewn mes, ei fab hyd yn oed yn ceisio dod yn frenin yn ei le, a gofio dianc oddi wrtho fo. See, God speaks through the universe, through his word in the Bible, and above all, through Jesus, the Word who became flesh. A goedd yn y dechreuad gyda Duw. A mae am i ni yn nabod e fel Dafydd. Ar lefel bersonol, mae disgrifiad y brenin Dafydd yn golygu llawer i minnau hefyd. Ers fi fod yn 15, since I was 15, God has been very precious to me throughout life, and his word in the Bible has meant so much. And knowing God through the difficulties of life and the happy times, when I fail, and yet knowing and experiencing the peace of God that comes through forgiveness and knowing that he loves me. He is God of the small things and the big things in life. So coming to a summary, mae'r bydysawd yn Anferth. Ni'n jyst edrych allan ar y darluniau yna. Mae prosesau mynd mlaen yn ein cyrff ni heb ni wybod dim amdanyn nhw. A maen nhw'n arbennig. Dwi'n rhyfeddu at sut maen nhw'n digwydd. Yn aml, dwi wedi gweld dagren dod lawr wrth i weld sut mae pethau bach ma'n digwydd yn y Gell. The processes of life are truly amazing. And lastly, that God speaks through the universe, through the Bible, and through Jesus Christ for us to come to know him.